Back in April 1847, April 7 to be exact, Joseph Bates published a vision that God had given Ellen Harmon. He published it as a broadside. I have a copy here of this vision. Actually, Ellen White received the vision on April 3, Sabbath, April 3, 1847, wrote a letter to Joseph Bates, and Joseph Bates was so impressed with this vision that he had it published and sent widely around the country. Published from Topsham, Maine, April 7, 1847. In this vision, Ellen White describes being taken from earth to heaven, and there in heaven being ushered into the heavenly sanctuary, where she saw the different articles of furniture in the heavenly sanctuary, in the holy place, and then into the most holy place. She was shown the ark. She was shown inside the ark the table of the 10 Commandments. And around one of the commandments, the fourth commandment, there was, as she described it, a halo of glory surrounding that Sabbath commandment. She was shown more details about this Sabbath, that it has not been changed, that God never instituted a change of the Sabbath day, but that it was changed by a counterfeit system. She saw that this Sabbath would be a testing truth for the Advent people and for the professed followers of God in the last days. And that it would be, I quote, the great question to unite the hearts of God's dear waiting saints. And then she was shown that as the time of trouble began, I quote, we were filled with the Holy Ghost as we went forth and proclaimed the Sabbath more fully. Proclaimed the Sabbath more fully. What was it that God had in mind when He was describing to Ellen White this prediction of a time in the future when God's people would proclaim the Sabbath more fully? Now we have those who are suggesting that this means understanding that not only the seventh-day Sabbath, but all of the Jewish festivals are to be kept as mandatory by the Adventist Church. This is one interpretation of keeping the Sabbath more fully. I am not persuaded that that can stand the test of biblical scrutiny. While I do invite my students over to celebrate and enjoy some of the beauty of our Hebrew heritage in the Jewish festivals, I do not find that the New Testament indicates that the festivals are still mandatory after the cross, when the ceremonial law reached its statute of limitations. If you have more questions about that, happy to spend more time on that this afternoon as we talk about the sanctuary service. But I don't see that as the fulfillment of what it means to proclaim the Sabbath more fully. When one looks at the context of this vision, it becomes clear, just reading down a few more lines, that what Ellen White had in mind, what God had in mind for His people in proclaiming the Sabbath more fully, was that we should not just see the Sabbath as the right day. The Seventh-day Baptists saw that for centuries before the rise of the Advent movement. What God was showing His people in the early days of the Advent movement was that the Sabbath must be linked with the sanctuary message. That the Sabbath must not be just seen in isolation as one of the 10 Commandments, but that whole law must be seen where it is in the heavenly sanctuary. That the Sabbath is at the heart of the sanctuary message. And the difference between the Seventh-day Baptists, who are still around today, and Seventh-day Adventists, Seventh-day Baptist, just a few thousand members. Seventh-day Adventists bulging over 10 million members now today, is largely due to the fact that the Sabbath message in the Adventist hope has been linked with present truth, with the last day present truth. It's not just the right day to be kept, but it is in a special last day sanctuary setting. God longs for a people to be proclaiming the Sabbath in its sanctuary setting. That's what gives it its power. The message, its power. Well, Ellen White, in later years, in writing the book Great Controversy and other works, she fleshed out what God showed her about the last day setting of the sanctuary Sabbath message. She showed how the Sabbath would be the final test of how the sealing of God's people would be linked with their willingness to be settled and established in the truth, and especially as it is climaxing in the Sabbath message. It's interesting to me, however, that after writing The Great Controversy, Ellen White then wrote another book entitled Desire of Ages. And in the Desire of Ages, she writes a lot more about the Sabbath. She proclaims it more fully, if you please, in the light of the sanctuary. But in the book Desire of Ages, she emphasizes more of the experiential dimensions of the Sabbath, of how it makes a difference in our life. If you put those two messages together, the Desire of Ages and the Great Controversy message that Ellen White emphasizes about the Sabbath, you come to the conclusion that preaching the Sabbath more fully is linking it with the sanctuary, but is at the same time linking it with the soul temple of this sanctuary of my heart. It's not just the right day, it's the right way for my life. And I'd like to suggest that for our postmodern minds, who may bristle at just a list of dry texts, they want to see that the truth makes a difference in someone's life. As the Sabbath School mission story was told to us this morning of those who have seen Sabbath keepers that have a special glow of peace in their faces that makes the truth winning and winsome to those who hear it. We saw last night that the sanctuary message is not just centered in the Solomonic temple and in the tabernacle at Mount Sinai. We saw that the sanctuary goes back in time to the very beginning. The Garden of Eden was God's first sanctuary on this earth. And it was a copy of an heavenly sanctuary from the very beginning of created time. So I'd like to suggest that we stretch our minds for a few minutes here this morning to see the linkage between the Sabbath and the sanctuary in its larger dimensions. That we go back to the beginning, where God first introduced Adam and Eve to the Sabbath, and in its linkage with creation and with the Garden of Eden, that first sanctuary, I suggest we may find some experiential dimensions of how to preach the Sabbath more fully in today's dying world. So if you'll open your Bibles with me to that opening section of Scripture, I'd like us to explore the richness of the Sabbath, and I'd like to focus upon the fact that the Sabbath is not a noun. The Sabbath is a verb. The Sabbath is not just a day. The Sabbath is a way. It's an active experience with God. And in the description of creation, where it links the Sabbath with that Garden of Eden sanctuary, we find the Sabbath presented in this electrifying, active language of the verb as well as the noun. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 1. Thus the heavens and the hosts, the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended His work which He had done, and rested on the seventh day from all His work which He had done. As we go back to the beginning and see the Sabbath as a verb, God rested on this day. Now, the word Sabbath doesn't even occur in the creation story. Did you notice that? But the verb Shabbat, from which we get Shabbat Shalom, from which we get Sabbath, the verb is found in Genesis 2:2. Shabbat is the verb. Shabbat means to cease, to stop. God was working for 6 days, and on the seventh day, He stopped. Sabbath is a time for physical rest, physical ceasing from our work. I learned about that special blessing of Sabbath when I went into high school and got my first job. I was a dishwasher in Barron's Hospital, and I washed mounds and mounds of pots and pans every day after school. But on Friday night, I didn't have to go to work. And on Sabbath, I didn't have to go to work. And my mom was kind to me. She didn't even make me do the dishes on Sabbath. I could just be free from that rigor of activity. That still sticks in my mind. And on Friday night and all day Sabbath in our home, we are kings and queens. We don't do the dishes. Well, when Saturday night comes along, we turn out to be paupers and servants again, and we do the dishes that have accumulated during the day. But I like the idea that God has given us a day that we just don't have to worry about working. What a great gift! Even the world understands this principle of the rhythm of 1 day in 7. But they're often out of rhythm with the right day in 7. So the Sabbath has the special blessing of physical rest. And this is linked all the way back to creation. But when we move to the account of the Ten Commandments, where we again are reminded of creation in Exodus 20 and verse 11, you all are familiar with the fourth commandment in Exodus 20. The seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God, and in it you shall not do any work. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Now the intriguing thing about the fourth commandment is that in Exodus 20 and verse 11, it's not the word Shabbat. It's another word for rest, giving us another dimension of Sabbath rest. It's the word Nuach. It's the same word that you find in the name Noah. God called Noah, and said, I'm going to bring the world rest through you. It's not emphasizing physical rest. It's emphasizing tranquility, serenity, peace. It's attitudinal rest. It's, wow, I can just let down and rest my mind on the Sabbath day. Have you found that dimension of Sabbath rest? That first came to me as a college student at La Sierra College, when I just had to wrestle all week long with those Greek vocabulary words and other difficult assignments. And when Friday night came, I was released from the tyranny of my professors for 24 hours. I could simply just settle back with tranquility and serenity and say, I don't have to open those books for 24 hours. God says, the Sabbath day is a time when I want to give you mental rest. Nuach rest. Well, we turn over a few chapters to Exodus 31, where again God links the Sabbath with creation. And this time it's after He has described the building of the sanctuary. He's described 6 acts in the building of the sanctuary, and now in the 7th act, starting with verse 12, Exodus 31, verse 12, just as He created in 6 days, and then the 7th day was the Sabbath, so He tells Moses to create the sanctuary in 6 acts, and then His 7th act is describing the Sabbath. And verses 12 to 18 are all about the Sabbath. But in verse 17, He links it with creation again, back with that original sanctuary in space in the Garden of Eden. Verse 17, the Sabbath is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. And on the 7th day He rested and was, what? Refreshed. Refreshed. Exodus 31, verse 17, gives us another dimension of this Sabbath rest. And this is the word nafash. It's related to a word that we studied in our Sabbath school lesson this morning, nephesh, the soul, or life. God rested and literally took on new life on the Sabbath. He was refreshed. This is the word that you find in Psalm 23, where God says, through the psalmist, the inspiration of the psalmist, He restoreth my soul. He restoreth my nephesh, my life. Now those two words in Greek, interestingly, the word for soul that we heard this morning was psyche, and the word for restore is iatrias, or iatria. You put those together and you have psyche iatria. Do you hear psychiatry there? That's the word. That's where we get the word psychiatry. Psyche iatria, the restoring of my soul. God is saying, I want to be your psychiatrist. Every Sabbath, you get a free experience with a divine psychiatrist. A free session in restoration of your soul. Don't you like that? We all need a little psychiatric treatment. And God is providing preventive psychiatric medicine. Every Sabbath, He says, I want you to join me, just as I was refreshed, just as I took on new life on the Sabbath, so I want to restore your soul every Sabbath. Preaching the Sabbath more fully by experiencing physical rest, mental rest, and emotional rest. You notice all of these have been connected back with the sanctuary, back with the Garden of Eden, back with God's original plan for mankind. Now stay in Exodus 31, because there's another verb. Sabbath is a verb. Another verb that is startling when one first recognizes it. It's in the previous verse. We read in verse 17, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. Now go back to verse 16. Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual sign. Now what does not appear in your English translation is that the word in verse 17, God made the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and the word in verse 16 where God says we are to observe the Sabbath, it's the same Hebrew word. It's the word asa. In Exodus 31, verse 16, the word asa, to make. God says, just as I made the world in 6 days, so I want you to make the Sabbath. You thought about that? The Sabbath is not lay activities time in the way of just ceasing doing anything. The Sabbath is the time for the most active experience of all. Just as God was active in making in space for 6 days, so He wants us to be creative on the Sabbath. Creative, experiencing celebration. Some of the translations translate this to celebrate the Sabbath, to experience it with vibrant, celebratory joy. By fellowship with family and friends, by going out and sharing the Sabbath joy with our less fortunate. Isaiah 58 describes the meaning of the Sabbath. In fact, the whole chapter, not just verses 13 and 14, are about the Sabbath. This has not been usually recognized. We go to verse 13, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day and call the Sabbath a delight, yes. But the whole context of the whole chapter is speaking about Sabbath keeping, where it is describing those of us who are God's people going out to relieve and help those who are in need, visiting the sick, visiting the suffering, visiting the despondent on Sabbath, bringing hope to them again. My wife is director of the youth department in our little church in Eau Claire. And in past years, they had tried a number of things to get the kids interested and active on the Sabbath. But you ask the traditional Eau Claire teenager about their experience of the Sabbath, what's one word that summarizes? They don't think of any of these verbs we've been using. For them, the word is boring, boring, boring. And many have tried competing with Hollywood to entertain our kids on Sabbath. Does it work? It doesn't work. You can't out-glitter Hollywood anyway, but the kind of glitter that Hollywood provides does not really satisfy down deep in one's soul. And so there have been experiments different places in the country, and we learned about this and have been doing just some our experimenting ourselves there in the little Eau Claire Sabbath school, of taking out our kids on Sabbath afternoon, nothing fancy, going to the nursing homes, making cards for these people that are stuck in the hospitals, going to sing, sometimes even going to places like the Pound, where there are a lot of lonely dogs and cats that need to be stroked and given some love on Sabbath. You know, it's amazing what's happening in the hearts of those teenagers when they come out from singing, from sharing the hospital and at the nursing homes and other places. There's a glow about them. There's a happiness because they've been able to make a difference. And as we go from room to room in the hospital, we have a chance to testify in a very special way I don't think we take advantage of with our Sabbath outreach ministries. My wife has trained our kids there at the Eau Claire Church to, at the end of singing to wherever they are, they just give a little testimony. They say, you know, we're so busy during the week, we don't really have time. We'd like to come every day to visit in the hospital, to visit you kids. We go to the pediatrics ward. But we're so busy doing our homework and stuff. But, you know, because of we're Seventh-day Adventists, and God gives us a whole 24 hours that we can set aside just to help people, just to come and cheer people up. And so we're here because we want to share a little bit of Sabbath joy with them. And it's amazing. The lights go on in people's eyes. People that had thought of Adventists as just those people that are weird, going to church on the wrong day and eating the wrong foods or not eating the right foods and that kind of thing. They start clicking. Adventists are there because they love. Because they want to share. They want to make the Sabbath by celebrating and sharing and creating. Active involvement. And so the Sabbath is not only a time of physical rest and mental rest and emotional rest, but a time of social rest, creative rest. This is all part of what I see it to mean in experiencing the Sabbath for the last days, so that we're not just keeping the right day, but we're experiencing the right way. Now, we've already been to Genesis 2, but I invite you to go back there again. We've looked at the obvious in Genesis 2. God stopped working. He Shabbated. He ceased. But go back to look at what is hidden between the lines, what is implicit in these words. Genesis 2 and verse 2. And on the seventh day, God finished His work which He had done. God finished His work which He had done and rested on the Sabbath day. And He invited Adam and Eve to rest along with Him. We'll see that clear in just a minute. But Adam and Eve rested from what? How many days had they been working? None. They were asked to rest not from their work, but they were asked to rest in God's finished work. Have you thought about the implication of that? The Sabbath is a memorial of God's finished work. And every Sabbath, whether our work is finished or not, and it usually isn't for me, I don't know about you, but I just stop. And I enter into God's finished work. Already before sin, God is telling us by the Sabbath that there's nothing that we can do to contribute toward favor from God. It's all a gift of His love. And especially after sin, there's nothing that we can do to commend ourselves to God. There's none of our works that we can try harder and harder and harder, and finally God will say, I accept you. No! The Sabbath message is the message that every Sabbath we declare to the world righteousness by faith. The gospel of entering into God's finished work. For those who say Adventists are legalists because they keep the Sabbath, I ask them to consider that Adventists keep the Sabbath because we believe in righteousness by faith. Because every day, every Sabbath day, we want to show the world what is true every day. That we can't do anything to commend ourselves to God. That as sinners, there's nothing we can do but rest in His finished work. And so when Jesus died on Calvary, He again rested on the Sabbath. He said, it is finished. And He rested from His work of redemption. And He invites us to enter into that finished work. And so another verb of Sabbath keeping, of proclaiming the Sabbath more fully, is found here in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 2. The verb kala, to finish. To finish. Here is gospel rest. Genesis chapter 2. Back to Genesis, not Exodus. Genesis 2 and verse 2. We proclaim the Sabbath more fully as we see it as a sign of righteousness by faith. Gospel rest. In that same section, in verse 3, we find that after God ended His work, after He Shabbated, He rested on the seventh day. Then in verse 3 it says, God blessed the Sabbath day, the seventh day, and sanctified it, because in it He had rested from all His work, which God had created and made. The sixth verb of Sabbath experiential rest is that word blessed. God blessed the Sabbath day in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3. This is the word, if you have the story of Deborah and Barak, it's the word barak, to bless. And when God blesses something, the word bless in Hebrew doesn't just mean to put your hand on someone and say, bless you, my child. Bless you, my child. I can do that to as many people here as I want, and I don't have any power to empower you to do what you should do. But when God blesses something, the word implies in filling with the power to accomplish that which He intends. When God blesses the Sabbath, He fills it with empowerment for our spiritual life. The Sabbath is a day of power. That's why in Exodus 31 and verse 13, the Sabbath is a sign of sanctification. Exodus 31:13, God says, keep the Sabbath that you may know. It's a sign that I am the Lord your God that sanctifies you, makes you holy. God fills it with power. Have you experienced the power of the Sabbath? We heard again in the Sabbath school of how it makes a difference between those who keep the Sabbath, even in terms of your health, in terms of your strength. God longs to give us on this holy day a special measure of spiritual power, of spiritual strength. In Psalm 92, that entire psalm, which is devoted to a psalm for the Sabbath, it has one stanza that deals with the sanctifying power of the Sabbath, and it describes how keeping the Sabbath you will be like a cedar of Lebanon. You know, that mighty cedar that stands there on the Lebanon mountains, no matter how strong the gales are against it. It's the cedar that is impervious to decay. That cedar which has a special rosin on the bark so that no bugs can get in there to destroy it. It can't be destroyed by any disease, by any infiltration of bacteria. God says, I want your life to be like that. The Sabbath power that I long to have overshadow you not only during the seventh day of the week, but to flow out into all the other weeks. My Spirit that's there on the Sabbath day will empower you to live this glorified life, this sanctified life. And that brings us to our last of the Sabbath verbs. The one we've just seen here, it is not only gospel rest, but it is empowered rest. It is empowering rest. But in chapter 2, and again verse 3, it says, God blessed the seventh day, and He sanctified it. He sanctified it. And that leads us to our last verb regarding the Sabbath. Genesis 2 and verse 3. The word kodesh, or kadash. And I'll put down what that is in just a minute. Kadash, kodesh, to make holy, to sanctify. How does God make something holy? How did He make the burning bush holy? How did He make the sanctuary holy? By His presence filling it. The same way with the Sabbath, even though it's not specifically stated here, it's implicit in this word kodesh. When God sanctified the Sabbath, He promised to be there every Sabbath. He makes it holy by filling it with His presence. The Sabbath, therefore, is a day, but it's more than a day. It's a person. It's a date as well as a day. God says, in effect, I want to come and have an all-day date with you. And I want to start it in the evening as the sun is setting, the most romantic time of all the week. I want to start my intimate fellowship with you. And I want to invite you to a 24-hour rendezvous of romance with your loving God. That's what the root meaning of Kodesh is, of making holy. God is saying, I want you to get intimate with me on the Sabbath. I didn't understand very much about intimacy when I started La Sierra College. I had never really had a steady girlfriend. I was too shy to ask any girls out. There at La Sierra College, my first year, I had to have some guys down the hall draw me maps of the girls' dorm and write out exactly what I was supposed to say for my first date. I was a very shy and late bloomer in things of romance. But one day in the cafeteria, this vivacious young lady appeared before my eyes, and I was never the same. I stayed long, eating much longer than I usually gulped down my food on those cafeteria lunches and evening meals, because she was wiping down the tables, and I got to be able to maybe sometimes even talk to her as she came to my table. I fell in love with Joanne. I'd been a theology major, and languages don't come easy for me, even though I have to teach Hebrew now at the seminary. I work hard. I was riding the driving lawnmowers to make my way through La Sierra College, and I put up little 3x5 cards with Greek vocabulary words to learn as I drove the riding lawnmower around the palm trees of La Sierra. I hit a few palm trees, and I almost hit a few people trying to look at vocabulary words while I was also trying to cut the grass. But an amazing thing happened to me after I fell in love with Joanne. Yeah, I still had to learn the vocabulary words somewhere, but I found more often than not those little 3x5 cards had words of love songs on them that I was learning to sing to my beloved. I was learning them because I had to? No. When you're in love, your heart breaks forth into song, and you sing, and you share, and you pick roses, and you give to your beloved, not because you have to, but because the principle of love flows forth from within. And God says, that's what the Sabbath's all about. I want to have an intimate relationship with you, more intimate than even lovers know. In fact, when Joanne and I got married, the first year seemed to go by so slowly to look to that first anniversary to celebrate that we couldn't wait that long. We said, we got to have some special statement of celebration longer than more often than once a year. So we invented, and I'm sure many of you have invented it, but don't tell me because I wanted to think that we were the only ones that invented it. We invented what we called month-iversaries, when every month on the 28th of the month we would set aside a special time to celebrate our love. You know, God couldn't even wait a month. God had to have week-iversaries because He loved us so much He couldn't stand to stay apart without celebrating for a whole year or a month. He had to do it every week. And so the Sabbath is the time for intimacy with our God, for intimate rest. And you know, I've come to the conclusion in recent years that intimacy with God is the only way to grow in the spiritual life. You can do all the other right things, but time, intimate communion time with God, is the way to grow. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you abide in me. As the apple tree among the woods, so is my beloved among the trees. Song of Solomon, chapter 2. I sat down under His shadow, and His banner over me was love. Ellen White uses that passage to describe the intimate relationship between God and His people. What's the ultimate purpose of the Sabbath? God makes the day holy by His presence, because He wants to have an intimate relationship with us. So Ellen White could write in Desire of Ages 283 that the Sabbath is for communion with God. The purpose of the Sabbath is communion with God. Now, if the only way to really grow in the spiritual life is by intimate communion with God, and if the heart of the Sabbath is for communion with God, can you put two and two together? The Sabbath is therefore embodying the secret of victory in the Christian life. The Sabbath is time for that special intimacy that causes us not to do the right things just because we have to, but causes that love song to flow up within our hearts so that we put on our riding lawnmowers of our lives words to love songs to sing to our God. And we choose not just month anniversaries, but week anniversaries and even day anniversaries. We just want to be with God all the time. God says, "Oh, my people, will you experience the Sabbath that way?" Yes, proclaiming the Sabbath more fully does mean a deep connection with prophecy and the sanctuary message. Yes, we need to see the Sabbath in its linkage with the great prophetic waymarks. But ultimately, the Sabbath is not about a day. It's about a person. And the ultimate rest is intimate rest with our beloved God. Why is the Sabbath going to be a test in the last days? Because here on this day we have an opportunity to show what real intimacy with God is all about. Because here on this day we find the secret of what real victory in the Christian life is all about. Because on this day we worship God not because of anything we get from Him, not because of any of the goodies that He provides for us, but we worship Him because we have found in that communion with Him a God that we've fallen in love with, a God that is so special to us that we'd rather die than miss that time with Him. This person, the God of the Sabbath, has invited us to proclaim the Sabbath more fully, to proclaim the Sabbath as a time for physical rest, for mental rest, for emotional rest, for social rest, for gospel rest, for empowering rest, and most of all, for that intimate rest with Him. Jesus said, "Come unto me, all that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The very next verse in Matthew talks about the Sabbath. He links the Sabbath with this kind of rest, with this coming into intimate fellowship with Him. The world is waiting, brothers and sisters, to see us proclaim the Sabbath more fully in our own lives. May I invite you to experience this kind of rest with Jesus. I came on the plane, and as I got on the plane and decided I wanted to have a little more worship, I opened my Bible. And there in my Bible was a card from my beloved stuck in the page in the middle of the Bible. "You're always in my heart." And that gave me courage coming here to Loma Linda. And I opened my luggage to take a shower Friday night to pull out the clothes I was going to wear, and there was another card from my beloved. And then I got out my other suit this morning to wear, and there was another card from my beloved. I love her a lot more, even than those days at La Sierra College. She means the world to me. But God says that the intimate relationship He wants to have with us on the Sabbath makes our love relationship just pale into significance. God wants in every page of this book to give us a little card, a romantic card. "I love you. Come and enter my intimate rest." Will you join His invitation? Let's pray. Father in heaven, I thank you for that girl back home, Joanne, my lover. Thank you for the cards that she's given me, the ways she's told me so many ways how much she loves me, for the way she overlooks my faults and just keeps encouraging me and trusting in me. And I can't believe that love can get any better than that. But you've said that you want to have an experience with us linked with the Sabbath day, coming to be with us on the Sabbath day, that makes the greatest lovers in this world pale into significance to your great intimate love. Lord, I choose to state to you again today, be my beloved God. I want to accept a rendezvous with you every Sabbath and let that intimacy spill over into the whole rest of the week. Lord, I pray for the Adventist Theological Society, for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, for the Loma Linda contingency of Adventists, that this whole community may see a message of proclaiming the Sabbath more fully as we go forth living the Sabbath in rest with you. In Jesus' blessed name I pray. Amen.
You have been listening to another special American Cassette Ministries presentation. This recording has been digitally reprocessed from the original audio cassette in order to make this CD available. The audio quality was improved as much as possible. International copyright American Cassette Ministries, all rights reserved. To order CDs or audio cassettes of this or other presentations, or for a free catalog, please call toll-free 1-800-233-4450. International calls, please dial 717-652-7000. You may also order from our secure website at www.americancassette.org. There you will discover the largest selection of genuine Adventist preaching available. American Cassette Ministries is not a one-man band. It's an orchestra of outstanding speakers who are all on the same theological page. You can trust ACM. There's no compromise here. If American Cassette Ministries has been a blessing to you, why not take a moment just now and send us a note or an email with your testimony. Our email address is info@americancassette.org. We'll share it with the speakers and volunteer workers to encourage them. Your prayers and financial support are important to ensure the continuation of this ministry as we help prepare America and the world to meet Jesus Christ. He's coming soon.